Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Chief Dan George, which I'm reading out of Jeanette C. Armstrong and Lally Grauer's Native Poetry in Canada. So Chief Dan George, most people would know as an actor, actually, rather than a poet, but he was a multifaceted individual. He was an incredibly good actor, but he also wrote poems, he wrote essays, He was an across-the-board sort of Renaissance man type figure. He did quite a lot of things. He was very much an activist for First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Metis rights. And his poetry reflects that, right? His poetry reflects these sort of dual elements that are central to sort of not necessarily protest poetry as such, but to indigenous protest poetry in a particular vein, right? It's poetry that is written for indigenous people. So it's not protest poetry in the sense of writing back to colonial Canada or the United States. It's protest poetry written to encourage indigenous people to maintain their identity, maintain their culture, maintain their inner strength, etc., etc. Some of it is directly written back to the colonial state, settler colonial systems. Like A Lament for Confederation, for instance, was delivered to an audience probably primarily of white Canadians in 1967. And it is a critique of Canada's dispossession and cultural genocide of First Nations people. But many more of his poems are written to indigenous people, particularly younger indigenous people, to encourage them to maintain their traditions. So I'm going to read you a couple of those. So this first one is Words to a Grandchild, and it's a bit lengthy, but it's good. Words to a Grandchild. Perhaps there will be a day you will want to sit by my side asking for counsel. I hope I will be there, but you see, I am growing old. There is no promise that life will live up to our hopes, especially for the hopes of the aged. So I write of what I know, and someday our hearts will meet in these words if you let it happen. In the midst of a land without silence, you have to make a place for yourself. Those who have worn out their shoes many times know where to step. It is not their shoes you can wear, only their footsteps you may follow, if you let it happen. You come from a shy race. Ours are the silent ways. We have always done all things in a gentle manner, so much as the brook that avoids the solid rock in its search for the sea and meets the deer in passing. You too must follow the path of our own race. It is steady and deep, reliable and lasting. It is you, if you let it happen. You are a person of little, but it is better to have little of what is good than to possess much of what is not good. This your heart will know, if you let it happen. Heed the days when the rain flows freely. In their grayness lies the seed of much thought. The sky hangs low and paints new colors on the earth. After the rain, the grass will shed its moisture. The fog will lift from the trees, a new light will brighten the sky and play in the drops that hang on all things. Your heart will beat out a new gladness if you let it happen. Each day brings an hour of magic. Listen to it. Things will whisper their secrets. You will know what fills the herbs with goodness, makes days change into nights, turns the stars and brings the change of seasons. When you have come to know some of nature's wise ways, beware of your complacency, for you cannot be wiser than nature. You can only be as wise as any man will ever hope to be, if you let it happen. Our ways are good, but only in our world. If you like the flame on the white man's wick, learn of his ways, so you can bear his company. Yet when you enter his world, you will walk like a stranger. For some time bewilderment will, like an ugly spirit, torment you, then rest on the holy earth and wait for the good spirit. He will return with new ways as his gift to you if you let it happen. Use the heritage of silence to observe others. If greed has replaced the goodness in a man's eyes, see yourself in him, so you will learn to understand and preserve yourself. Do not despise the weak. It is compassion that will make you strong. Does not the rice drop into your basket whilst your breath carries away the chaff? There is good in everything, if you let it happen. When the storm closes in and the eyes cannot find the horizon, you may lose much. Stay with your love for life, for it is the very blood running through your veins. As you pass through the years, you will find much calmness in your heart. It is the gift of age, and the colors of the fall will be deep and rich if you let it happen. And as I see beyond the days of now, I see a vision. I see the faces of my people. Your sons' sons, your daughters' daughters. Laughter fills the air. There is no longer yellow and heavy. The machines have died. Quietness and beauty have returned to the land. The gentle ways of our race have again put us in the days of the old. It is good to live. It is good to die. This will happen. So the cool thing about this poem is, while it talks extensively about things in the world and relationships with the natural world, with other people, with indigenous people, with white people, all of these different things, that constant refrain of "if you let it happen" really puts the emphasis on the listener, right? This is the ethical task of the young indigenous person coming up in a settler colonial world where their culture has largely been destroyed and displaced. And it is an ethical responsibility, right? The way that this poem frames this is that it is an ethical responsibility to live rightly, right? To live in harmony with the world, to protect yourself, to preserve your culture, all of these things. It is very much, and the emphasis for all of the discussion of external elements, it is an internal task. It is a thing that the reader must do. And I think that's very cool. So the next one I'm going to read you is called "Keep a Few Embers from the Fire." And this is again about preserving indigenous culture and the responsibility of the reader to do that. Keep a few embers from the fire that used to burn in your village. Someday go back so all can gather again and rekindle a new flame for a new life in a changed world. And I mean, this obviously, I think it's obvious. This is not necessarily about keeping physical embers, right? This is about keeping memories. This is about keeping cultural connections, things like this, right? So this is envisioning a world of what's called indigenous resurgence. And basically the idea of indigenous resurgence is a return among indigenous communities to their own sovereignty, to their own cultural practices, their own ways of political organization, their own ways of socioeconomic organization, etc., etc. This idea of keep the embers, that is, keep the cultural memory of your traditions alive, and then someday go back so all can gather again to rekindle a new flame, right? That's the indigenous resurgence element. It is envisioning a future era in which indigenous people can live according to their own traditions and their own ways of being in the world. And in order to do that, they have to survive through the destruction and devastation of settler colonialism and capitalism. And so they have to maintain their own identities, ideologies, worldviews, etc., in spite of the forces trying to destroy those embers. The last one I'm going to read to you is called To a Native Teenager. And this one is really interesting. It's extremely relevant to the experiences of Indigenous people really across the world in settler colonies, right? In Canada, in the United States, but also in places like Australia and New Zealand, where Indigenous cultures, Indigenous peoples have been displaced from their lands and their particular, and the very much locally rooted cultures, and often displaced into cities. And that comes with sets of problems while also coming with sets of benefits, right? In Canada and the United States, for instance, you have this idea of pan-tribalism, which is basically a sort of ideological movement that was really born out of the American Indian movement starting in the 1970s. This idea that rather than every nation, tribe, individual group being distinct, Indigenous North Americans should see themselves as part of a collective culture, and that can be a source of strength, while also maintaining the individuality of Cree culture and Mohawk culture and Pueblo culture and Comanche culture and things like this, that you can have both. You can have that sort of intersection of the Indigenous experience while also having the distinctiveness of the Indigenous experience. But a lot of that was born in cities where Indigenous people of various nations, various cultures, various backgrounds were sort of thrust together in poverty for the most part, and that sort of forged a collective identity that didn't necessarily predate settler colonialism, right? The Inuit would not necessarily see themselves as the same people as the Choctaw, for instance. So that's important context, I think, for this one. So this is To a Native Teenager. You are unhappy because you live far from the city that promises everything, and you think yourself to be poor because you live among your people. But when you live like a person of city breeding, you will not hear the plants say, "Eat off me," nor will you take from the animals because of hunger. The ground will be so hard that you will want to run from place to place, and when you have gone too far, there will be no moss to rest on, nor will your back find a tree to lean against. Your thirsty throat will long to savor water from the cup of your hand, instead of the liquid that lives in a bottle will burn your tongue. Soften your mind and make your heart ache for the sweetness of spring water. Tears will keep your eyes moist because 1,000 small suns that never come nor go flicker everywhere. The wind will not carry messages from land to land, and the odor of countless machines will press on your chest like the smell of 1,000 angry skunks. You will look at the sky to pray for soft rain. Instead, you will find above the treetops lives another city that stands between you and the guidance of stars, and you will wonder where city people keep their dead. A longing will rise in your heart for the days of your boyhood, and your fingers will grip the sacred tooth you hid in your coat pocket, but the train that carried you into the city never brought the spirit along that guides lost hunters through the woods. Again and again your eyes will try to see the evening dripping off the sun like wild honey, and your nostrils will quiver for the scent of water that tumbled through the canyons of your childhood. You'll stand at a corner amidst the noise and bow your head in despair because you are humbled by the desire to touch your father's canoe that he carved when you were born. Wherever you look, there is nothing your eyes know, and when weakness settles into your legs, you will recognize your brother by the shadow his hunched body casts in the corner of a street, in a city where people walk without seeing the tears in each other's eyes.